From Pacifica Radio, this is Voices of the Middle East and North Africa. I am Malihe Razazan, and with me here is Khalil Bendib.
For over 1 month now, Sudan has been living its own Arab Spring, which began on the campus of the University of Khartoum and spread nationwide from there. This movement has received little media attention in the West so far.
They began inside the dorms, the female dorms of University of Khartoum students, who gathered and protested at the dorms. They marched into the university and they were chanting against the recent austerity measures.
We'll talk to Maha Essanoussi, a prominent activist and blogger, who was detained by security forces last month as she was trying to cover the protests for her blog and various online media. As the civil war rages on in Syria, Jordan has become a haven for 130,000 Syrian refugees.
We are hearing reports from the borders that increased numbers of pilots are defecting to Jordan, Syrian pilots.
We'll talk with Amman-based veteran Middle East journalist and analyst Lami Andouni. Last month, Jordan's Muslim Brotherhood announced that its political party, the Islamic Action Front, would boycott the early parliamentary elections scheduled to take place later this year. This comes at a time when Jordanian King Abdullah is trying to gain legitimacy through cosmetic reforms. Shahram Aghamir spoke with Middle East analyst and veteran journalist Lami Andouni about the significance of this boycott, as well as the situation of hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees who have fled to Jordan.
The Islamic Front is not the only political party that will be boycotting the elections. All the protest movement and opposition groups are boycotting the elections, most of them, because of the electoral law. The electoral law is a law that was enacted in 1993. It's a law that restricts the voters to one vote in each district, meaning that if you have 4 or 5 people running for the parliament in one district, you only can vote for one. And why is this bad? Parliamentary life was restored in Jordan in 1989. You need to build a pluralistic and a political culture and a parliamentary culture, especially that the tribal culture is strong in the country. So when you have such an electoral law, people tend to go to the person closest to them because such electoral system curtails the ability to have political coalitions, because even if a society is tribal or tribal values are very strong, when you are able to make political coalitions for a parliamentary elections, it opens people to different views, and people start thinking in terms of political party or parties in political programs. But as we have seen, what happened to the Jordanian society and the political culture in Jordan, that has become not only more tribal, partly as a result of the electoral law, there have been divisions within the tribe itself, because a seat in parliament has become a symbol of the power of the tribe. It's not the power of political party. It's not about representation anymore. And that has resulted in many tribal frictions and has weakened the influence of political parties. The reason that law was enacted, there were 2 reasons. One, it was an attempt to undercut the representation of the Muslim Brotherhood. Secondly, to undercut the opposition groups in general, not only the Muslim Brotherhood. Thirdly, the electoral districts were divided in a way that, together with the electoral system of one man, one vote, would result in weakening the electoral power and the voting power of the Jordanians of Palestinian origin. I'm not saying that Jordanians of Palestinian origin should have a specific number of representatives in the parliament, because the country shouldn't be divided between Jordanians and Jordanians of Palestinian origin. But they should feel that as citizens, there shouldn't be an attempt to undercut the representation. And it's very dangerous for a country's culture of pluralism and sense of popular participation to undercut the role of the opposition. So we have really witnessed, and we are witnessing, the fallout from that law. And we are seeing more societal violence. It's not only because of the law, but the culture that the law produced or enhanced weakened the sense of belonging to a country and weakened the sense of the feeling of citizenship. The whole concept of citizenry has been undercut because if you're a citizen, you want to feel that you have rights and that your rights are safeguarded, that there is a parliament that represents your rights, that represents your interests. And why people feel that they were not represented properly, because over the span of almost 20 years, many policies, especially economic policies, were passed by the parliament, approved by the parliament, which increased the class divisions in Jordan, the gap between the societal and economic gap between people.
Jordan is a monarchy, and some have described this political system in Jordan as a liberal autocracy. How much power does the parliament actually have?
Exactly. The part of having a democratically elected parliament with political parties and friends represented is to strengthen the parliament. The parliament is powerful, meaning that all laws have to be approved by the parliament, governments have to be approved by the parliament. But when you have a parliament which is mainly representing the people who have money to spend, it's political money, and tribal interests, in addition to the flawed electoral law, the last parliamentary elections were rigged. And it was proved by human rights organizations and political organizations that the intelligence department was directly involved in rigging the elections. And now the former chief of the intelligence is being tried on charges of corruption. What that trial has exposed is the money that was spent, is the way that department, security, had interfered, even spent money to promote certain candidates, as well as rigging the vote, like bringing whole boxes and replacing them with the original ballot boxes. However, even if the parliament becomes very powerful, and even if we get a good electoral law, and even if there will be fair and free parliamentary elections, the parliamentary powers are again restricted because the king has the right to appoint government and to disband the government and to disband the parliament. So as long as he has these powers, then he controls everything, he and the security agencies.
Lami, you mentioned the protests in Jordan. There have been continuous protests in Jordan ever since the Arab uprisings began more than a year and a half ago. The protests seem to have remained small and peaceful, if you will, but they are continuous. And the response to these protests have been reshuffling of the prime ministers, reshuffling of the cabinet by the king, essentially making the prime ministers act as a shield against the protesters. Tell us about these protests, who is involved in it, what are some of the demands, and so forth and so on.
First of all, I have to stress here that until now, the majority of the protesters have been calling for the reform of the regime and not the overthrow of the regime. But this could change any time. There have been slogans calling for the overthrow of the regime here and there. But that has not become the slogan of the protests in Jordan. The main demands, at least reform demands, they want elected governments, meaning they want the parliament to form the government. And some are calling for curbing some of the powers of the king, including they want the king to be deprived of his privilege of appointing governments and of disbanding governments.
Would this be in line with the constitutional monarchy that was established in 1952?
The constitution of 1952 was more democratic. Since 1952 until recently, there were amendments to the constitution that increased the powers of the king and increased the powers of the security. But under the pressure of the protests, some of those articles were dropped and new articles were introduced. The articles that were introduced were progressive, but they didn't go far enough. And people are still calling for changes of 3 articles that allow for a real parliamentary government to be formed. And the new constitutional amendments did keep a state security court, and this is very problematic. But though it has confined its areas of authority to include terrorism and drug trafficking, but the security court had to be abolished because, as we are seeing now, the security court is being used against activists. I've been writing articles about how the security court is being used to outlaw political activists because most of the activists are being arrested and tried in front of the security court, and this is unconstitutional. They've been releasing the activists, but the message that's being sent is that we are going to get you. And it's very clear. Most activists I know, and I know almost all of them, all of the ones who were tried and are being tried are still on trial, are still wanted. They cannot leave the country. And for trumped-up charges.
There is a demand for political participation.
For accountability.
For
the trying of all officials proved to be corrupt.
All right.
Of course, the corruption issue is very sensitive because there are two kinds of corruption. One, where as a result of the introduction of neoliberal policies, of course at the request of the IMF and the World Bank and the pressure of Western governments, Jordan went through a privatization process of many of the strategic industries like the cement, the phosphate, the potash, and Jordan has limited resources. These and tourism are its resources. Now we are discovering that those were sold at very, very low prices to Western companies who have local partners who are people who are very influential. So people are asking for the nationalization, or at least the state buys back a big part of these companies because we're going through very dire economic crisis. The other kind of corruption is the usual corruption. I mean, the embezzlement, the deals that were done in the name of the government with big commissions. And so people are very angry. And some of the people who are accused of corruption are not corrupt. But, because people have become suspicious of all people who have ever held important positions. Officials have become guilty until proven innocent. Many people feel that the king himself is corrupt, or at least has benefited from corruption. But the dilemma is that people have not supported the change of the system, the overthrow of the system, for many reasons. One, although it's a bad system, it's not a bloody system compared to like Syria or Libya or even Saudi Arabia, and there are more freedoms here, like even in Qatar. In Qatar, you cannot have a protest unless it's sanctioned by the government. And also because people are very afraid of Israel, of intervention, because Jordan has the longest borders with Israel. And because there are many Palestinians here, many Jordanians feel Israel will take advantage of any turmoil in Jordan to push more Palestinians into Jordan, because Israel claims that Jordan should become the substitute homeland for the Palestinians. So there are many fears. The other fear is many people, although the Muslim Brotherhood is strong, but a big part of the society also does not want Muslim Brotherhood to lead Jordan, because I don't like the monarchy, but it's more secular and tolerant of minorities. Minorities feel safe here. Like all Jordanians, they feel that there should be more rights and they should be properly represented in Jordan and should participate in the decision-making process. But at least they don't want to see an Islamic state, the applying of certain, the imposition of social conducts which some Islamic view or claim to be Islamic. And the other one is that the tribal mentality is strong here. When I speak tribes, we're not talking about tribes who are living in tents. We're talking about people who have PhDs, people who might speak different languages, but still tribal belonging is very strong because of the weakening of the political parties. So many people are afraid also that the tribe mentality will rule if the regime collapses, and that there's a battle among the tribes, or conflict, power struggle among the tribes. The other, of course, at the beginning, people were not as afraid, but after the winning of victory of the Islamist different Arab countries, And when they see how Syria has succumbed
engulfed in turmoil.
Engulfed in turmoil and almost a civil war today, and that many parties, either the regime or parts of the opposition, in order to interfere in the shaping of the new regime. So people don't want to see Syria. They don't want to see even in Egypt anymore. I mean, if we were talking a year ago, people wanted to be in Egypt, not in Jordan. But not anymore, although, I mean, many people are waiting to see. And remember, we have strong constituency for the Islamists, so they're also happy. So not all of them are unhappy about it, but at least half the society. The Islamists, if you're talking about their voting power, it could be 20% to 30%, which is large, but it's not the whole society, not the majority of the society. And also, it depends a lot on how the Islamists, especially the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, Mahmoud Morsi, it depends a lot on his performance, because if he proves to be respectful of minorities, respectful of social freedoms as well as political freedoms, that he really committed to pluralism, then people will be less fearful of the Muslim Brotherhood, even if they don't support them. So the situation now is not the situation a year ago when people were very euphoric about the Arab revolutions. However, we have a serious economic crisis, and the Jordan's debt is approaching an alarming to it.
Lami, so I was just going to ask you about that. The youth have been playing a major and a visible role in anti-government protests and uprisings in Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, and so forth and so on. And one of the issues is the issue of unemployment and absence of social justice, which is worsened by the economic crisis. Is Jordan experiencing a similar thing in terms of...
It's experiencing what might be worse. We're afraid of the collapse of the economy.
And Jordan has a young population, doesn't it?
Young population, 60% of the people are under 30, which is very young, and there's education in Jordan. I mean, good education. You talk to students who don't see the point of why they went to school. Why, like I read an article by a young man saying, I was so excited to be a student. I never missed a class. I wanted to be the first. I wanted to get grades, but for a year now I couldn't find a job. And even if you find jobs, they are not high-paying jobs, and there's no future. Also, Jordan depends a lot on aid and loans. And the aid meaning that you depend a lot on the West and on Gulf countries. And aid comes with political conditions.
You're referring mostly the money coming from Saudi Arabia and
Qatar. They
yes.
are promising money, but I think they are insisting that Jordan support Western intervention in Syria or their intervention in Syria. Okay, most of the people here support the Syrian revolution, but we have at least part of the public opinion has switched to supporting the Syrian regime because they're afraid of what they see in American, Qatari, Saudi intervention. But most of the people who support the Syrian revolution, who were an uprising, or the Syrian people, even if they don't support, many people don't support Syrian opposition or part of the Syrian opposition, which has tied itself to the Americans or the American government or to the Gulf states. But not all of the opposition has become reliant on the Gulf states, but part of the opposition has been scandalous and shameless. But even those who support the revolution don't support the intervention because they don't trust America. They don't want to see another Iraq in Syria. They don't trust Qatar. They don't trust Saudi Arabia. So they don't want Jordan to become involved in intervention. So they'll be against the regime if they do it, even though they support the revolution.
And the regime itself, its policy vis-a-vis Syria has been, officially announced policy has been neutrality.
The Jordanian regime has been trying not to interfere in Syria, but it has come because it needs the aid, come under a lot of pressure from Saudi Arabia to do something. And we are feeling the difference because they made statements that have sparked controversy and even anger. He said that the dialogue in Syria is futile. And people feel that he's saying that because he wants to send the Americans and to the Saudis and the Qataris that will go ahead, but we need the money. And also the people are very afraid here of the influx of refugees. According to the government, there are more than 135,000 now. But in the last 2 days, thousands have been crossing. They've been trickling mostly. But Now there's a flow, especially the fighting is now in the heart of Damascus, because it was not the case before. Also because of what happened to the camps. They were shelled. There are fears here in Jordan that there will be more Palestinians coming, and there is a trend in Jordan against more Palestinians coming, because they say we are becoming a minority. Jordanians are becoming a minority.
That was Lamis Andouni speaking with Shahram Aghamir about the political situation in Jordan, as well as what has been described as a major refugee crisis resulting from the civil war in Syria. We'll hear more after a break. From Pacifica Radio, this is Voices of the Middle East and North Africa.
Tell us more about the status of Palestinians in Jordan. And to be sure, a lot of these Palestinians, they are not post-1967 displaced people, but they were there even before 1948 or right after 1948 and uprooting of Palestinians in historic Palestine.
There were people before 1948 and there were people after 1948 who came not only from the refugees who were expelled, but also the West Bank became, including Jerusalem, became very impoverished after 1948 because it was like the cutting of the body of Palestine. It was the severing of a vital part. I mean, so it did affect the economy. It did affect the society. People became poor. So many people came to Jordan, and in 1954. The king of Jordan imposed unity on the West Bank. And from 1944, all of the Palestinians in the West Bank, and including Jerusalem, because we never differentiated between the West Bank and Jerusalem. This is new that people speak, including Jerusalem. Of course, it's including Jerusalem, became Jordanian citizens. And it was never a problem. Okay, after the PLO became strong and it challenged the regime here, it was a problem, but not as their citizenship, but because the Jordanian regime suspected their loyalty because many of them supported the PLO as well. But most recently, there's a totally new problem. Is that suddenly a trend of East Bankers have been preaching and promoting a very discriminatory discourse that says that Jordan is under threat, we have limited resources, it's an Israeli conspiracy that all Palestinians are here, there's the Palestine, why don't they go to Palestine?
This is the East Bank of Jordan River, which has been traditionally a base of support for the king, for the Jordanian kings, right?
Yes, but I will explain how many of the East Bankers now are leading the opposition. This trend transcends both groups, the loyalists and part of the opposition, that feel that there shouldn't be many Palestinians in the parliament, there shouldn't be many Palestinians in government posts or university posts, and that has really started a division in Jordan, which is very, very dangerous, because we are citizens. Why should we be excluded from opposition if we are qualified for the opposition? There shouldn't be like a quota for Palestinian parliamentarians, but there shouldn't be also an attempt or a plan to make sure that there aren't more than 19 Palestinians in the parliament.
Is that what you have now?
Yes, out of 120.
To be clear here, more than half of Jordan's almost 8 million people are Palestinians.
But mind you, Jordanians of Palestinian origin are not asking for a demographic representation. We're all Jordanian citizens, and when you talk about separate Palestinian representation, it should be represented by the Palestinian organizations vis-a-vis Israel, not vis-a-vis the government of Jordan. But to make an attempt to reduce the number is bad because historically, Palestinians have not necessarily voted for Palestinians. They voted for politicians they liked.
So they don't necessarily vote along sectarian, if you will, sectarian
not
lines.
At all. Yes. Not at all, but if the situation continues, this is what we are fighting here. We're fighting against this trend becoming the rule.
And the regime's response has been to accuse of the Islamists as being affiliated with Palestinian Islamists and so forth and so on.
Exactly. And many tribes in Jordan are fighting the Islamists not because they are against the Islamists, but because they see them as representative of the Palestinian voting power. And so it's a multi-layered and complex problem.
Since we were talking about people who are displaced by the turmoil in Syria and the conflict in that country, I do remember reading a report that stated that close to 140,000 displaced Syrians have actually come to Jordan. Is that number accurate?
The government is talking about 135, but that's close. In the last few days, we are hearing reports from the borders that thousands are crossing.
Yes, that's what I remember.
And in addition to the increased numbers of pilots who are defecting to Jordan, Syrian pilots.
But in fact,
the last one defected today.
And how are Syrian refugees being received in Jordan? How are they being treated and where are they being placed?
They are in the north. There are certain procedures. One of them, first of all, UNHCR is involved. And they have been put in buildings and they are now constructing 20 camps more. And UNHCR has a contingency. UNHCR, which is United Nations High Commission for Refugees, has been working on expanding the camps, and it has been asking the European community and Americans and Canadians for more financial support, and they've been sounding the alarm that there might not be enough resources. On top of that, Jordan has a severe water crisis.
Syrian refugees, are they being held in camps, as it is in case in Turkey, or they are actually being allowed to go out?
Many are allowed to go out, and they are working, especially in the north, and we are feeling their presence. I remember it was like the beginning of the crisis in Iraq. There are many Iraqis in Jordan, as you know.
How many Iraqis actually ended up and stayed in Jordan?
At least 1 million or more.
For a small country of that size,
it's increasing the resources of Jordan.
Yes.
Some are not living in camps. Some of them are living in buildings, apartment buildings that were empty, and people keep on sending contributions to them. But there's another problem, another crisis. Many of those who came, or at least we're talking hundreds, not thousands, are Palestinian, are according a very different treatment, a very bad treatment. They've been put in a building which is not very accommodating, it's not in very bad conditions, and they are confined to these buildings because when it comes to the demographic threat, it's Palestinians who are a demographic threat as seen by some Jordanians.
Human Rights Watch actually had a report 2 weeks ago talking about how Palestinians from Syria who come as refugees to Jordan, how they're being treated completely differently from Syrian population.
Yes, and it's a serious crisis, and I think the government would have to be objective here, that the government itself would like to deal with them differently, but it's afraid of the backlash. And I know that certain personalities, very credible personalities, who are from the opposition in Jordan, very respected people, have met with senior officials here and said, we will get a number of Jordanian businessmen to say, we'll sponsor these people. We will be their guarantors. They will be in the country as Palestinians. You can find them and all of that. But the government is afraid to even grant them that.
But they do allow that, I understand, if the guarantor or the sponsor pays up $15,000 to the government. They can actually have the Syrian refugees go out to the
Syrian or
Palestinian. But Palestinians, I guess, they're not allowing that.
Yes, exactly. The government is going through a serious, they're not bluffing, economic crisis. But they have to be open and they have to be credible in order for people to share that burden with them. But people don't trust them. So there's a serious crisis of trust.
Let's talk about the United States' role in this. As we know, the United States has this free trade agreement with Jordan. It has had it for many years. And also there are some special enterprise zones in Jordan that actually are involved in manufacturing garments for the U.S. market. Different brand names such as Walmart, Kohl, Macy's, and Nike's, and so forth and so on. Tell us about the ties between the United States and Jordan.
The U.S. would prefer to keep this regime. However, there are always speculations if this government king proves to be very unpopular. The biggest speculation in Jordan and the fear in the palace that they would bring one of his cousins or one of his brothers to rule instead of him. So I think this could be an American scenario. But what I've been hearing from the young people of the protest movement is that the American embassy has been trying to contact them, and most of them have been refusing. But they send them messages asking questions like, what's your view of America? Which made the protest movement feel the Americans would work with anybody if they can secure stability in the country. But, the protest movement is also a very anti-agreement with Israel, so they are not willing partners. I mean, only some of the elites could possibly collaborate with the Americans, but like in the grassroots movement, you will not find any of that readiness. There's people detest the treaty. Israel is still holding Jordanian prisoners of war. This is one of the reasons. Secondly, in addition to the appeal of the Palestinian cause, and people see it as just and as their cause even, Jordanian cause, the treaty itself has been very unfair to Jordan in terms of water, resources, and in terms of, they feel that it's a humiliating treaty.
That this is the peace treaty that was signed in 1994, was it?
Yes, 1994. Okay. Yes, there have been many enterprises. And some of the protest movement has a social, economic awareness, leftist awareness. They're against neoliberalism, against capitalist infiltration. They're aware of that. Some of them aren't. They just want to be able to secure a decent life for their children and their families. But there's resentment, most of all, to factories which are run by foreign companies and which don't treat, which either they feel that exploit the resources of Jordan and they don't benefit the community and the country. There's a resentment of how some of them treat the workers. So that's more on the agenda, more than look at Walmart. I mean, among the leftists, more sophisticated politically, yes, you'll find that. Number one on the people's mind is that the West is exploiting Jordan, especially the potash, the phosphate, and the cement. These are the biggest files in Jordan.
So where do you think the protest movement is heading? What does the regime have in its arsenal to prevent further escalation of these protests?
I think that it doesn't have many cards as the regime thinks because they are squandering their cards. One of the main cards that they are squandering is to understand that the protest movement has been giving the regime and the king a chance to reform. I mean, some of them joke about it. They say, we're begging the man to reform. What does he want? Does he want us to stay down with the regime? By the way, the slogans have been against the king. That was not the case a year ago.
So you can see radicalization of the protests?
Yes, radicalization, yes.
But are they becoming
so
more...
So far, the protests have not been violent, but you never can tell. Part of the reason they're not violent is that the regime, there has been violence committed against demonstrations, the protests, but it's not been on a regular basis. They don't practice violence every time. And secondly, they haven't shot any protester. I think the moment they start shooting, then forget about stability, forget about reform. People will be talking about overthrowing the regime.
Lami Andouni is an Amman-based veteran Middle East journalist and analyst. To learn more about this week's program, visit us at vomina.org or jadaliya.com. From Pacifica Radio, this is Voices of the Middle East and North Africa.
بحب البحر لما يزوم وعشق صرخته في الريح واحس في موجه شوق مكتوم لناس حرة وحياة بصحيح بحب البحر لما يزوم وعشق صرخته في الريح واحس في موجه شوق مكتوم لناس حرة وحياة بصحيح واحبه لما يتهادى وادوب لما يوشوشني ويفرش موجه سجادة في أحلامي تعيشني.
For the past month, there have been unprecedented protests in northern Sudan, which are showing no sign of slowing. The protests, which began on June 16th, after the government announced the removal of fuel subsidies, have been getting hardly any coverage in the Western media. Malihe Razazan spoke with prominent Sudanese social media activist Maha Essanoussi, who is active with the Gharifna youth movement, which in Arabic translates to "We're Fed Up," a movement opposing dictatorship in Sudan.
Fuel subsidies is just the start of it. Following that decision, we've noticed a hike in prices of other basic commodities like sugar and bread, and this has affected every Sudanese household on so many levels, and it's also affected transportation. Like bus tickets now is really expensive, and for most ordinary citizens, they can't afford it. And Ramadan coming up, it's really a struggle for this average Sudanese citizen to just get by at this point.
Tell us exactly, how did this protest begin on June 16th?
Well, they began inside the dorms, the female dorms of University of Khartoum students, who gathered and protested at the dorms. They marched into the university and they were chanting against the recent austerity measures because they've been affecting them on a really intense level. They can't afford meals, they can't afford basic registration fees, so it was really hard on them. So they went out and they protested. And their protest was met with extreme violence, where the security forces actually raided the dorms and they fired tear gas into the dorms. This was probably at night. It was a night protest. So the next morning, there was another protest, but this time the female students were joined by their, male counterparts, and it expanded onto the campus of the University of Khartoum. Then it gained momentum, and then more students joined, and there was hundreds, actually thousands, chanting against the austerity measures. This movement grew over the following weeks, and it extended not only to University of Khartoum, but neighboring universities and local neighborhoods, and, members of the Sudanese community have joined, professionals, the women, civil society members, opposition party members. A lot of people joined, and they've been protesting on a regular basis every Friday almost, and where the protests launched from inside the mosques. After Friday prayers, the protesters gather, and they chant against not only austerity measures, but against the regime itself.
These protests, which, as you said, often begin from mosques after Friday prayers, have had a very, very creative and interesting themes to them. The first Friday, I believe, was called Sandstorm Friday. One of the Fridays was called Elbow Licking Friday. Another one was called Outcast Friday. How did the protesters come up with these names?
The Sandstorm Friday was basically just to let the NCP know, we're coming, and this is going to be a sandstorm for you. Sudan is famous for sandstorms. It's always haboob and sandstorms, Khartoum and all across Sudan. So the protesters thought there's a sandstorm, and it's gonna shake the NCP throne, which it did because it was the first organized Friday. The following one was Elbow Licking Friday, where it was a direct reference to President Bashir's advisor, Nafi al-Nafi, who once mentioned that the Sudanese people have a better chance at licking their elbows than overthrowing the regime. So the protesters went and they were like, we will lick our elbows. We're tired of, being patronized, and we're tired of being treated this way. And they called it Elbow Licking Friday. The following one, which was Outcast Friday, referred to President Bashir's latest speech. He went and he actually called the protesters, he referred to them as outcasts. So it was another direct challenge at him that, we are the outcasts, we are the protesters, and we will bring down this regime. The fourth Friday was the Kandaka Friday. Kandaka is a title for brave Sudanese queen or brave Sudanese woman. So it was dedicated for all the strong revolutionary women of Sudan and the mothers of the 2,000 or so detainees and the wives and daughters of the detainees. It was a day dedicated for them. So it's mostly themed. Every Friday has a theme. I believe this Friday will be Darfur Beledna, or Darfur is our country or our state Friday.
And in a way, you're also trying to bring different communities together in these protests.
Exactly. And, after the Darfur conflict, we in the north, there's some hostility to an extent between people in the north and people in Darfur because they feel like there's no solidarity ever since the conflict broke out. But this Friday is dedicated to let these people know, you're our brothers, you're our sisters. Darfur is also one of us. It's not just Khartoum, it's all of Sudan. We already lost the south, but we still believe that it's one country and we're all one people. So trying to get all the masses together and try to bring an end to this streak of NISS or the NCP's repetitive discrimination and stereotyping, and it's been going on for 23 years. There's tribalism. We're trying to just put an end to that and just trying to show that it's not about just Khartoum or just the north. It's about all of us, not just Darfur. Probably there will be another Friday for the Nuba Mountains, Blue Nile, South Kordofan. We need them to know that we're all in this together.
Sudan has been getting a lot of media coverage at certain junctures, whether it was the North-South split or the tragedy in the Darfur region. And one would imagine for these protests to also get some media attention. On the contrary, there seemed to be very little interest for foreign press corps to cover these protests. How do you explain that?
I think that even if it weren't for the Arab Spring right now, the media and, the international community, they have Sudan fatigue. The Darfur situation has been ongoing for years, and Sudan never ceases to enter new conflicts. So I think the world has Sudan fatigue, and the world also has revolution fatigue. I think the media is waiting for something huge to materialize in Sudan before they broadcast it. There's so many revolutions, so many areas of focus right now, and Tahrir has already set the bar really high. They expect Sudan to have 10,000, 1 million protesters, mega protests in one day. And that's extremely difficult at this point because we started with 100 and then 500 and then 1,000 and now recently 5,000. So the numbers are expanding very gradually, and particularly with the intense clampdown by the security forces here in Sudan, it's not easy. 10 people gather, and immediately the security forces rush with their rubber bullets and their tear gas. So people are afraid of that. We haven't really reached the stage where 1,000 or 10,000 can gather and protest peacefully. It's constantly met with violence, and to date there's about 2,000 people detained, activists and students, and even just random people picked up from the streets. So the media is waiting for something really huge, really massive. And, Sudan has always been marginalized by the media, regardless. So it's something that is expected. And we have all these conspiracy theories, Al Jazeera, and it has strong ties with the ruling party here. And it's not, the consensus is Al Jazeera sees no benefit in contributing to the success of the Sudanese revolution while it can by covering it, but it has been marginalizing it. And it's not of any less significance than, the Tunisian and Egyptian and Yemeni and Libyan revolutions. It's just as important, but it's not gaining enough coverage. And it's sad because people are being tortured and taken to ghost houses. People are risking their lives. Activists are fleeing the country because their lives are threatened, and let alone the people in the Nuba Mountains who nobody knows about right now, and they're dying. And we need the world's eyes right now. We need the coverage. We need the focus.
There are foreign correspondents in Sudan. So why aren't they covering these protests? I understand journalists and citizen journalists such as yourself who've tried to cover these protests have been arrested. Is that one of the reasons why foreign correspondents do not get close to these protest areas? Or there are other...
I'll just give you my personal opinion. Heavy crackdown on whomever covers the protest, whether it's a local journalist, a foreign journalist, a student, a citizen journalist, it doesn't matter. The NISS or the Sudanese security forces, they immediately arrest anyone just at the sight of them near a protest. So many foreign journalists have already been deported back to their countries for covering the protest. So I think foreign journalists are scared of being present, and they get their news via phone or via internet. And most of the time it's not accurate. It makes me really sad because we depend on them. They have immunity. We don't have immunity.
So Maha, you're telling me that foreign journalists who are covering Sudan, from Sudan, they get their news via internet or phone conversations?
I mean, I'll tell you this, I don't want to generalize, but I've never been to a protest where I ran into one of the correspondents of major news outlets. I mean, it never happened. I see the same faces all the time. I see the same activists, and I see the youth. I've never seen an actual correspondent. So this is my evaluation, my assessment of things. I may be wrong, but this is what I think. I mean, it's not easy. It's scary, and it's understandable. But contact the people who are on the ground, or just attend the protest. They have immunity. They have embassies to protect them. We don't have that. We don't have that luxury.
You are a citizen journalist and a blogger, and you were arrested twice, and you were detained and released, and then late last month, the security forces raided your home as well. There has also been a systematic crackdown on independent newspapers in Sudan. This year, the authorities have closed down several newspapers and confiscated dozens of entire editions before publications. So how are local journalists able to report specifically on the protests and more broadly on the government's economic policies?
Well, the security police is monitoring every edition of every newspaper before it goes to print. And consequently, so many editions have been confiscated. Al Jareed newspaper and the objective news outlets. Mainstream newspapers here in Sudan, they're biased. Of course, they're owned by the government and the state, so it's not really a reliable source. There's only a number of newspapers that are reliable, but they are extremely monitored and they get confiscated very, very often. So with the protests that are ongoing right now, you will never read any piece of news on a newspaper in the morning about a protest the previous day. It's never going to happen. They're actually run by the security police. What journalists are doing, they're turning into online journalism. That's basically all we have right now. We have citizen journalism and we have online journalism. And, we're just hoping that the world would hear us. And we're trying to reach... It's not easy to reach everyone on a grassroots level if you're not distributing newspapers, because not everyone here has access to laptop or internet. So they don't really get the news. They don't know. Some of them, they don't know that, there's intense protests going on. There's arrests, there's crackdowns. So there's something else that, worries me a little bit, that we need to reach out. We need to reach bigger audience, and that's not happening with what the security police is doing with the newspapers right now.
Who are the online activists?
There's so many online activists. There's, you can find them on Twitter. There's a lot on Facebook. There's the youth movements. They're active on Facebook and they're active on Twitter, and they have blogs and websites. They're reliable sources of news. There's so many online outlets that can give you unbiased and reliable information.
So, Maha, internet penetration in Sudan is low. It's about 10% of the population who have access to the internet, and about 15% use mobile phone. But the local news websites and Twitter account run by Sudanese activists have been really vital, as you said, to disseminate information about the protest movement. How closely is the internet monitored and filtered by the government?
The first part of your question, well, there's been a noticeable increase of Sudanese Twitter users over the past 4 weeks. I think thousands have already joined, and they're interested. They signed up just to learn about what's going on the ground, because there's no means for unbiased information. But the government's already shutting down online forums like Al-Rakuba. Al-Rakuba and Sudanese Online has a large number of hits every day, and they've been shut down. I don't know. I can't access them from my laptop. I've been trying for the past few weeks. Apparently, they've been blocked. But Facebook is quite active. I don't think they're able to control Facebook. But there's the online army, like they call it. They're just a lot of security officials. They're all over. They infiltrated Facebook, and they're trying to do the same to Twitter. But Twitter is not. It's a little difficult to infiltrate Twitter, but what they do is they enter these, websites and Facebook pages, and they try to discredit the information that's there. It's a problem, really, because there's like thousands of them, and they're everywhere. It's like an army, an online army. But still, even with that, internet is the best source of news for Sudan. And I don't know about the statistics, 10%, 15%, but internet here, I can get internet on my phone for £1 per day, which is less than 50 cents, actually. For 1 day, I can get access on my phone 24/7, and it's easy. People have smartphones. They use them during the protests. They upload. Technology has been growing here, and right now there's more awareness about these things, and people are buying smartphones, because flip cameras, they're trying to document what's happening. And more people are joining the internet just for following the Sudanese revolution.
Because in one of the tweets by Salma El-Wardani, the Egyptian journalist who was deported from Sudan late last month, she was warning of the government's effort to shut down the whole internet and mobile phone system. I was wondering if this is something that you hear about, that the government is actually going to shut down the system, or has it been able to shut down the system for a short period of time?
There's a major telecommunication company that's been shut down for an hour or two sometime in the past 3 weeks. But June 30th was marked a big day for protests because the NCP came to power on June 30th in 89. So June 30th was meant to be the final anniversary of the NCP, and the NCP was worried about that. And there was a rumor online that how to access internet if it's cut off. And people were just disseminating information about that because there was this powerful rumor that the internet was going to get cut off on that day. And what happened was that one telecommunication company just shut down for a matter of 1 hour maximum, and then it was back on. So it didn't really happen, and we were relieved about that. I think what happened is NCP is smart, and they don't want a repeat of what happened in Egypt. When the internet cut off, people had no choice but to take to the streets. I think in that context, they were smart about it. Cutting off the internet is a bad move.
So they're basically targeting bloggers and social media activists one by one. You were arrested, detained, and then your home was raided soon after. So can you tell us about your story and how social media activists are being targeted right now in Sudan?
I was caught the first time. I was with Egyptian journalist for Bloomberg, Salma Wardani, and we were in front of the University of Khartoum where a protest was scheduled to happen, but it never materialized. We were actually arrested from inside my car by 6 men wearing civilian clothes. They kidnapped us, basically took us to the headquarters of the NISS. Basically, what they do is they arrest people at random if you're seen next to a protest scene before it even starts. So this was the first time that I was caught, and being part of Gerifna youth movement, I was detained for about 4 or 5 hours, after which there was an intense interrogation, to which I was released. But I think mainly, I was released because of the intense campaign that was made for me and for Salma, and had already, in an hour or two, had already reached the media massively. I was detained again on the same day that Salma was deported. They detained me on the same night of Salma's deportation. Around 15 men in civilian clothes, NISS officers. They raided my house at midnight on the 26th of June, I guess. They raided my house. A couple of them were armed. They were in my living room. I was asleep, and I woke up, and I got dressed really quickly, and they came into my room, and they searched my room. They turned it upside down. They confiscated my laptop, my sister's laptop, a couple of phones, my personal camera. and a couple of other, irrelevant items that they thought was of, concern to them. So then they took me to their offices. It was midnight, and they released me 3 hours later after a gruesome interrogation. And I wasn't released, actually. I was told to come back the next day. I was summoned. So the next day I went, and they kept me for about 11 hours. Another series of gruesome interrogations and emotional abuse. And then I wasn't released either. I was told I can go back home and come back again the next day. So this is what they do. They try to hinder my work, and they make sure that I'm at their office. I'm not outside protesting. And they've done this to numerous female activists. They like to just raid their homes at midnight, and they've done this several times, and arresting people from their homes, arresting people from the streets and randomly. So there's this heavy campaign of mass arrests going on right now. And so many of my friends are still detained. An activist called Ali, he's a Twitter activist. He was detained on June 22nd. It's almost a month now, and no one knows his whereabouts. He's still detained by NISS, and he's only one of hundreds and thousands. So there's a really intense campaign on cracking down on activists.
You have an active blog. You tweet frequently. Are you concerned about what might happen to you again if they come after you again, arrest you or detain you?
Yeah, of course I think about it, but there's no time. I can't afford to be afraid right now. There's a revolution going on, and I need to continue doing what I'm doing, and I'm trying to keep as low a profile as possible. But just everything you do is a risk as an activist. When you're getting into activism in Sudan, you know that it's a risky business, but you have to do what you have to do. I can't stop blogging, I can't stop tweeting, I can't stop accepting interview requests. I have to, like I said, the media needs to focus on Sudan, and without people like me, that's never going to happen. So it's not an option for me right now.
What hashtags do activists in Sudan use to tweet?
We're using Sudan Revolt. If you access that hashtag, you'll find thousands of tweets about what's going on. I would recommend you follow youth movements such as Girifna. They're quite a reliable source of information. And there's also Razazan Network and Sudan Change Now youth movement. They're also actively tweeting and reporting.
Maha Essanoussi is a social media activist based in Khartoum. She blogs at mimsology.blogspot.com. For more information, visit womina.org or jadaliya.com. From Pacifica Radio, this is Voices of the Middle East and North Africa.
And for this week, this has been Voices of the Middle East and North Africa. We look forward to your comments and suggestions. You may reach us by email at vomekpfa@yahoo.com or by phone at 510-848-6767, extension 632.
You can download the podcast of our program on the archives page of Voices of the Middle East and North Africa at kpfa.org. Voices of the Middle East and North Africa is produced at the studios of KPFA in Berkeley. Join us again next week for another edition of Voices of the Middle East and North Africa. الدكتاتورية هذه حكم سيادي